Good morning, everyone. Are we doing sound or no? There we go. Okay, now, good morning. We are sitting in for Dave one more week. Never fear, he will return. He is hoping to be back next week to start a new sermon series, and we are going to be super happy to have him back. But in the meantime, Matt Defner and Courtney Mead are joining me this morning to just let you in on a little bit of what Carne has meant to them, in hopes that this isn't just the end of a sermon series. Really our hope is that it's the beginning of all of us understanding better what it looks like and what it would be like to become spiritual meat eaters. We want to move from being infants to the mature fulfillment of who God created us to be. So that's our hope, and we thought we would just start with kind of a review. So let's just look at Hebrews 5. This is where we started, that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Key words, reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. So you guys remember the chart that was up here? I think the stand has kind of broken. So Jesus learned obedience through suffering, and salvation came as a result. This is what has anchored us through this entire series, and it's what we aspire to. It's the example that we're trying to follow. The reason why we have to keep this kind of front and center is that we don't do a great job of following Jesus' example. The writer of Hebrews continues right after that section. We have much to say about this, but that's always a bad sign when you are starting with a good example and then there's the conjunction but. But it is hard to make it clear to you because you no longer try to understand. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word all over again. Those of you who are teachers, how do you feel when you've spent all this time teaching something and you have to reteach it because they've just kind of given up, right? It's a frustrating thing. So you need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with teaching about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. So again, key thought or key ideas that we're not trying to understand anymore. We're still needing milk because if we were meat eaters, we would be learning and training in righteousness, training ourselves to distinguish good from evil. So we struggle to do this because when the going gets hard, we tend to find an easier way. We tend to try and change our circumstances so we don't have to change our character. And instead of training ourselves, instead of submitting to God's plan with reverent submission, we complain about the discomfort, we complain about the hard, and it leads us to quitting. These were just some of the ways that this manifests itself. You can look on the left column and see what milk looks like, and then meat is on the other side. And so as you reflect on these things, Matt and Courtney, I want to invite you guys, how have you seen this play out in your life, this struggle between milk and meat?
Well, I definitely had a fake meat season in my life. And what fake meat to me was like is I filled up my head with a bunch of concepts about God and theology, and that's kind of where I thought I was thriving, I really did. And then I realized after a while that was really producing was really a spirit of self-righteousness and even defensiveness. And I kind of lost the grasp of the meaning of grace, I think. And grace really became a meat concept for me. Like I had to really digest it, and it took a long time to chew. Still takes a long time to chew sometimes, and I know that seems like a pretty foundational thing, and some people might consider grace kind of as almost like milk. And if that's the case, I guess I became lactose intolerant. But in any case, that's kind of where I have found a lot of meaning in this sermon series. So.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I was a kid, we would go to like Bible quiz bowl, and whoever knew the most verses was the winner. Mm-hmm. But that didn't really translate into change. Mm-hmm. So,
I think similar for me. It was just seasons of being unwilling to listen to what I needed to do. I knew what I needed to do. I knew what I should have done. But just a season of unwillingness and avoiding suffering at all costs, for sure.
Yeah. Paul adds to kind of this idea of stopping pursuing understanding in his letter to the Corinthians. He writes that, brothers and sisters, I could not address you as people who live by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. Like, that's an appropriate thing. Give milk to infants. But the problem is, indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly, for there is jealousy and quarreling among you. Are you not acting like mere humans? God, I guess, created us to not act as mere humans, but like him. And there it is. I mean, the reality is that humans tend to choose the easy path. And so Paul's saying, you still are not ready. In fact, you are stuck. How many of you have ever been stuck? Anyone? This reminds me of, just as we were talking through this, it reminded me of one of our kids, Jackson. He's 20 now, and I will say he did give me permission to tell this story. But when he was a baby, he never learned to crawl. And instead, he would scoot around on his bottom and kind of use his foot to propel himself. I don't know why. He just thought it was better for some reason. And so then he had his 1-year-old birthday, and we were like, okay, time to start walking. Like, this is when the doctors say should be doing this. So we did what a lot of parents do, and we would stand him up between the two of us and cheer him on as he's walking, coming back and forth. And he loved his newfound freedom, especially with this new push toy. I mean, it was like his crutch, right? Like, he could get around. But it wasn't very long before we noticed a problem, because when he would fall down, as all new walkers do, he would fall all the way to his back, and he would get stuck. It was like he was a bug that couldn't get up. And did you know that crawling is apparently developmentally necessary for the stages of movement that come later. It is supposed to develop these core muscles that help for a situation when the child falls. And so what happened is that Jackson had to go to physical therapy at the ripe old age of 1, and he had to learn to crawl. And so we would do exercises on our stairs because he didn't like crawling because he had found another way, an easier way to get from one place to another. So this was the closest we could get, and we would go up and down the steps. And after a couple of months, he was off and running again. So this just reminded me of the idea that when we get inspired to move, a lot of times we think we can do it in one big step, and we tend to find the easiest way to get from point A to point B. We insist on the milk version. And instead of learning to crawl, we skip to walking. And I think what makes this even more prevalent is that we look around and we see all these people who are walking around us. Jackson saw his big sister walking. He saw us. He's like, I want to do that. And so we think, well, we're just going to modify our behavior. We're going to find a way to help people see us walking. But we never get around to exercising those core muscles. And so when we fall down, we don't have the strength or the knowledge or the ability to roll over, get on our hands and knees, and step up. And this keeps us stuck. This is why we get stuck in those spaces. Indeed, you are still not ready. You are still worldly. Spiritually speaking, when we get stuck, it's usually because we've skipped a step. There's a piece of meat that we have not been willing to chew on, to take the time to chew. And so we try and go from milk to chunks of T-bone steak. I remember as a kid, we grew up on a farm where we were so spoiled, we got steak all the time. And I remember chewing it, but I couldn't chew it and swallow. So I would spit it out in a napkin and throw it away. And that was my version of eating steak. And so on the surface, I could pull it off, but my body wasn't getting the benefit of the protein. And so spiritually speaking, if anyone ever saw what happens late at night when I'm on my computer, or if anyone saw what really happens when stress drives me to drink too much, or if anyone knew how many cuts are under the sleeve, or if anyone knew, they would see that I'm stuck and I cannot get up. And it's interesting because science is showing us that there are reasons we get stuck. Our brains, God wired our brains for survival, especially when we feel unsafe. Trauma-Informed MD states this on their website, that when trauma happens at any of these ages, the child or young adult may become essentially stuck in that level of emotional development and interaction with others. There may be a lack of maturity as peers go on to the next stage of development, and they are left behind without treatment. This is all based on Erikson's theory of developmental stages. I know some of you have done study on this. And it shows us that each stage provides opportunity for developing maturity. And when that doesn't happen in safety, it will stunt the growth. And have any of you ever wondered, why does one event cause trauma in one person, but the same event doesn't necessarily cause it in someone else? And what research shows is that it's not necessarily the hard thing that causes trauma. It's the presence or lack of a supportive system to walk you through and process and heal the trauma. Isn't that amazing? God created us to be healers of one another. But if there's a kid who doesn't trust, if there's a story of something where something happens and they try and do it on their own, it's going to affect the brain differently than a child who goes through something like this and a caregiver, a trusted caregiver, is able to walk them through the process of healing. It's amazing. And so we might learn to walk, but we might have skipped some of these steps. And I'm guessing that every single person in here is stuck somewhere. It's going to be so important to recognize where we're stuck in order to be able to walk. If we hadn't recognized, if the doctor hadn't recognized, oh, he skipped a step, we need to go back to that step and heal it, then we would have been treating the wrong thing. And so, Courtney, what are the break points for you? How have you seen this process in your life?
So, I was raised in a Christian home by both parents that are still married. When you look at my childhood, it's seemingly un-trauma-filled. I don't know that that's a word. Sorry. It was squeaky clean. And so when I grew up, I was always raised that you listen to authority. Anybody older than you or the person that's given charge over you is the one that you listen to ultimately. And so that when I grew up and I became an adult, I was crippled. I could not make my own decisions. I felt I'm a 9 on the Enneagram, so for anyone who those matter to, peace is important, and the idea of disappointing somebody is really difficult. And so through therapy, I learned that I was stuck in like the child mentality. I hadn't ever let myself be an adult. And so anytime I bought a car, bought a house, chose a job, any of that, if I hadn't processed through who I deemed authority over me, I couldn't make a decision because I was stuck in the sense that I am unworthy, I'm incapable, I'm inadequate, I'm not an adult enough, I'm an imposter of my decisions. And so without processing through that with somebody else, I couldn't do it.
It's like you had fallen and couldn't get up.
Yep, I was a bug.
Man, I resonate with that. I'm a 9 too, by the way, so you're in good company.
Okay.
But yeah, and the imposter too just reminds me of Brennan Manning in his book Abba's Child talks a lot about the defensive mechanisms that come up, and he labels this person that kind of comes out of this as the imposter. And so that's pretty, that I resonate with that. So when I was about, 10 years old, my grandfather died, and he was a father figure in my life, and we were pretty close, and really had an impact on me. And when that happened, something flipped in my brain. And the thing that flipped in my brain was, I have to become responsible now. I have to grow up. And
You were going to have to skip all these steps.
yeah, well, that's kind of where my brain went, kind of in that adolescent stage when I look at identity versus role confusion. That's some of the stuff that I've struggled with as an adult, like I've struggled with performance identity and what's my role. And so that's kind of where I was stuck. And then what happened when I was a kid, some people noticed me taking responsibility in some of the areas that maybe a 10-year-old wouldn't normally take responsibility for. And they started to kind of applaud me and be like, man, Matt is growing up. And so I started to wear that kind of as a badge. I was proud of that. But what ended up happening is when I got into high school, when I got into more social settings, I didn't really know, it's weird, I didn't know how to relate to people. There were a lot of things that I was missing. And out of that, I think, not just that, I'll be honest, kids are mean, but I was bullied in high school quite a bit, and I sought acceptance from others where I could, which unfortunately in that season of my life led me to trusting untrustworthy people and not trusting the trustworthy people. Talk about insanity. And because I struggled to find this acceptance within the group that I wanted to be accepted by, I started to self-medicate. And I did that mainly through video games. I would just live life in this digital world where I could live out my fantasies, be accepted, and if I failed, I just go back to the safe point and try again until I passed. So,
Some people might think, well, of all the things, what's the big deal about video games?
Mm-hmm.
What was the big deal?
Well, I really think, and this is weird, talking about relationships with inanimate things, but I think there's that thing. You can have a healthy relationship with something or someone, or an unhealthy relationship with something or someone. And for me, it was all about the why. It was the why am I doing this? Also, how much time am I doing this? I had almost whole days that would be just wasted because I was stuck in a digital world. But the main thing for me is the why. The why was I did not feel accepted in one area of life, and so I turned to video games to try and fill that need.
Yeah. It's so interesting because God created us to be able to protect ourselves a little bit, but so often in our attempts to protect, we end up hurting ourselves because we isolate. So like you said, all this time you're pursuing relationship through a digital world, and that kept you from the relationships that you were craving in some ways. So last week, if you were here, you'll remember that we recognized that an important step in healing is revealing the shame message of the enemy. And Kurt Thompson had defined shame for us as an emotional weapon that attacks who we are and what we're worth. And what's interesting is that shame tends to result in some sort of hiding, often isolating us from God and people, and a lot of times both. And so let's just digest this a little bit. What message of shame has the enemy used against you, Courtney?
So when I think of shame, there's kind of two sides of it. There's the earned and the self-inflicted. And so there's the shame that you have for choices that you've made. I know this was wrong, but I did it anyway, and I feel shame for that, but that's a choice I made. Then there's the self-inflicted, being insecure and feeling like you're not worthy or unlovable or inadequate or fake. I tend to be my own worst enemy, being insecure in that. And so, I have self-perceived doubts about myself or the lies that I listen to about what people think of me. You're not this, you're not that, you're not enough, you're not whatever, fill in the blank. And so that's kind of like a spiral I'll get set on when I only focus on the shame aspect of it.
Yeah. And then what becomes your response when you're focusing on that message?
That I'm an imposter, that I'm not true.
Yeah. Fake it till you make it.
Fake it till you make it.
We just go into hiding for sure. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, so I have a fill in the blank kind of shame message to start out with. It's blank would be so disappointed with you. And when I think about my family, I talked about how my grandpa was a father figure in my life. I think about and he was a teacher too, and I did not do well the first couple of years in college, and that was a message that played in my head. Your grandpa would be so disappointed in you. And that can carry over to God, that can carry over to, people I look up to just in general. And then kind of the message that has been recent is, this is why you're not a dad. And that one, it's interesting. I know it's not true, but when I fall short, that's the one that seems to sting the most right now, this is why you're not a dad. It's this idea of, I'm going through a season of life because I'm not ready to handle the next season of life. And I have to keep telling myself, talking about the response, I have to keep telling myself that that's not true. But the truth of the matter is that I do go through periods where I do believe those messages, where I do believe that they are true. And I get pretty depressed when that happens. So.
Yeah. It's an emotional weapon that the enemy is using to attack us ruthlessly.
Yep.
And he goes deep. And that's why it's so important to not let the enemy be the only voice that's in the conversation. I think sometimes we just let the enemy's voice be there. And so as we talk about being able to eat meat and wanting to grow to maturity, that's going to include inviting Jesus and his voice into the conversation. We have to consider our 10-year-old selves. A lot of times we just try and change it right now. But if the wound or the injury happened when you were 10 or 16 or whenever, then it's almost like we have to go back to that space and invite Jesus into that space. It's interesting that the shame voice is so much easier to hear, but we all know that God calls us his sons and daughters, but I wonder if we really believe it. Do we live as if we believe that God is looking at us the way that he tells us? In 1 John, it says, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God." And that is what we are. Do you see? John is giving you an identity message. You are a son. You are a daughter. And how does the Father treat his sons and daughters? He lavishes his love on us. He takes great delight in us. He rejoices over us with singing. He pours his love out into our hearts. That is what is true. And that's the reason we invite Jesus into the conversation, because the enemy is attacking us with his whispers. He's trying to get us to believe the opposite. Are you really a son, Matt? If you were really God's son, delighted in by the God of the universe, then why wouldn't he let you become a dad? You feel it. He goes for the jugular. Courtney, are you really a daughter? Are you really good enough? Because I see things that you do. These are the messages that are coming. And what's so beautiful is that Jesus is inviting us to exchange that message for his message. So Matt and Courtney, help us out. How has God led you through that process? How has he invited you to exchange the message?
For me, kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation, the idea of grace and the idea of God's love and acceptance. I don't know if there's Parks and Rec fans in here, but there's Ben and oh my goodness, Leslie. Ben and Leslie are the two main characters. In their wedding vows, they share, "I love you and I like you." And I think God says the same thing to me, to us. "I love you and I like you." And I feel like "I love you" was something I could grasp when I was a kid, because just because the idea of it, you learn Jesus loves me when you're really young, and the idea of it makes sense, but that God actually likes me and is fond of me, that was a concept that I didn't really come to until I was an adult. I'm just reminded of this song by Andrew Peterson called Rest Easy, and the chorus goes, you don't have to work so hard, you can rest easy. You don't have to prove yourself, you're already mine. You don't have to hide your heart, I already love you. I hold it in mine, so you can rest easy. And that song, man, like, whenever I'm in that place, like, if I put that song on, man, it just so much releases.
Yeah,
So.
it's a way for you to hear Jesus' voice. Worship team, I'm going to go ahead and invite you up. We're almost out of time. But as we get ready to close, I want to give us all, as a community, an opportunity to recognize those places that we're stuck. I think we all have them. There was a place where we never learned to crawl, and we need to go back to that space and be willing to eat the meat that takes us to that space, because when we skip that stage, the enemy's been whispering words of shame to you ever since, probably every day. He's been saying things like, you're not good enough, you're not really a son or a daughter. It's what he did to Jesus. We heard about that last week. It's what he tempted Jesus with. Are you really a beloved son or daughter? But for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame, so that we might experience the joy of salvation that was earned through his obedient suffering. And he's cheering us on and inviting us into that same goodness. Colossians 2 says that he nailed our shame to the cross. He nailed our sin to the cross. And I love the Message's version of this. The Message says, think of it. All sins are forgiven. The slate wiped clean. Imagine your slate being wiped. That old arrest warrant canceled and nailed to Christ's cross. He stripped all the spiritual tyrants in the universe of their sham authority at the cross. Satan is using sham authority to try and convince us to live in hiding. But think about it. Jesus was scorning the shame of the cross while nailing our shame to the cross. It was a great exchange, and we're invited to exchange our shame for that kind of message. But in order to exchange, you have to know what you're exchanging. You have to bring it to light. You have to reveal. And so I want to invite you to look around the room. And when you do, it's just really easy to imagine that nobody else has this shame message happening on the inside. And it's weird to think that there's a battle going on, each person here. Because we see the fake it till you make it stance, right? We see that space where everyone's dressed and smiling and we're good to go. But on the inside, everyone in here is contending with shame. So a few brave people have agreed to help you see. And so I invite you to stand, the people who I've asked. And they are willing to show that shame is an active participant in their lives. But the beauty and the reason that they have the courage to even stand right now is that they've also experienced some victory because they've engaged the exchange. They've replaced the lie of shame with the truth of Jesus. And now eating meat, pushing forward, means repeating these messages that you are precious to me, you are honored, I love you. I can't see well enough. I am chosen, I am forgiven, that God it has made you as his workmanship, created to do, Dave, to do good works in this space. And eating meat means finding ways day after day to address these issues so that this is the foundation, the love that life springs out of. And so as we close this morning, I want to invite you into this great exchange. I want you to have confidence that this is a place where you can reveal the shame. And so I want to invite all of us to stand and let's pray. And then we're going to sing about God's faithfulness because that's why we can reveal our shame.